What was I thinking when I came up with the Leonard character? Did I have a master plan for this Let's Play? And were there any disasters along the way that made me want to pull my hair out? In this series I will answer these and more questions as we delve into the mind of madness. The mind of a Let's Player. When I decided to start a Let's Play of Skyrim Special Edition, I knew that the character was going to be a stealth character. I'd already done 2 full playthroughs of the original Skyrim, one with a mage archetype. I mean, he was an unusual mage, Steve. He was an orc, and he preferred heavy armor, but he was a wizard. He did use magic predominantly. And my second playthrough was a warrior playthrough. Again, a little unusual. Richard was a Breton for a start, and he was an academic, not a physical type person, but he was a warrior through and through by the end. So it did seem both inevitable and appropriate that for my third character I'd be going with a more thief archetype. Of course, I would be making it a little different. I wanted to avoid the stereotypical fantasy rogue trope that we all know and love. You know the type. The leather armor, dual-wielding stealth archer type character that is little more than a lightly armored warrior badass who can also hide really well. Because that's how about 99% of thief characters end in games like Skyrim, and I wanted to avoid that. And thus, Leonard was born. Because of course, Leonard does not like combat. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. In fact, Leonard doesn't want to get anything of his dirty. He's not a fan of physical exertion, and not because he's not capable of it, but because he sort of almost feels like it's beneath him. He really doesn't like things like blood or other people's body fluids because he is a little fastidious, and thus he is pretty ill-equipped to deal with basically 99% of what Skyrim will throw at him, at least from a personality point of view. It's not that he physically can't handle it, he just really would rather not. Leonard would much rather sit in some comfortable place and instruct other people to do these things for him. But of course, at the start of the game, he is aware that his lowly position does not grant him the power and influence to make that a reality, and so he knows to some degree he is going to have to get his hands a little dirty at times, and thus he does have some plans. So that's the personality I came up with for the Leonard character. Let's now talk more specifically about the character build, because I did have to tailor it quite a lot to be able to play this sort of character in the way I wanted to play him. Originally, I had imagined this character was going to be far more cerebral and manipulative as a thief, and thus skills such as speech, perhaps alchemy, would be more important than stealth. Of course, the vanilla game's speech is not particularly good. There are dialogue checks, and there are some mods that will expand that and even allow you to do things like convince people to open their doors to you, but it never quite worked as a primary method to achieve goals. So alchemy ended up being Leonard's main focus, and it was a lot of fun playing as an alchemist. Of course, I did use a perk mod, Ordinator, that made alchemy a more viable method of achieving goals, and it did so in a way that made alchemy quite powerful at times, but also very situational, which was brilliant, because this allowed me to have a character that, if he planned accordingly and he got his plans well executed, he could achieve what he wanted to achieve, and sometimes even make it look easy. But then if he got caught unawares or his plans went awry, it was very difficult for him to adapt, which meant there was a constant feeling that he was one mistake away from total disaster. However, what is probably more important than the skills Leonard ended up focusing on are the skills that Leonard ended up avoiding. And specifically, I'm talking about archery. Now, the question as to why a character like Leonard, who doesn't like direct face-to-face combat, didn't use archery, of course came up quite a lot when I first started playing this character, so much so that I ended up making a video where I discussed in detail why I'd avoided that. I'll leave a link to that video down below if you want the full version. But the short version is that I just did not want this character to end up becoming comfortable with a bow because he'd probably never stop using it. The problem with Skyrim and bows is they are so versatile. I mean, I was going to say powerful, because they are, they're pretty powerful, but it's more the fact that bows can be used pretty much non-stop from the beginning to the end of the game, and they can become a bit of a crutch. You can fight dragons with them, you can fight undead with them, you can activate puzzles with them, you can deliver poisons with them. If you're a stealth archer, you can probably annihilate 99% of the game without ever taking a scratch or putting yourself at risk. And honestly, I think a bow, especially in the hands of a stealth character, trivializes an awful lot of the content, and it would make it very hard to have Leonard in situations where he felt like he was out of his comfort zone. So I did not want to end up relying on archery as I did in my Richard playthrough. Of course, it's a completely different question when you ask why Leonard wouldn't use a bow. It's one thing for me, Gopher, to say I don't want Leonard to use it, but why didn't Leonard use it? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is bows are large weapons that require a lot of strength. People tend to think of bows as being used by slender, agile, elf-like people, and swords are used by big, brawny, strong guys. But in actual fact, the opposite is true. Swordsmen normally have to be fast, agile, and they can be quite slender. Bowmen tend to be big and strong. You need to be incredibly strong to be a bowman. It takes a lot of training, and you build up a lot of strength in the upper body, and it is a big, strong weapon. Even the shorter bows can have an amazing draw weight on them if you're going to be punching these arrows through armor, as you are in Skyrim. Bows are weapons of war, possibly more so than the sort of one-handed swords you find in Skyrim. These type of weapons are weapons that Leonard wants to avoid. He doesn't want to exert himself physically, but he also doesn't like the idea of carrying large weapons. They're bulky, they're in the way, they would interfere with, running away or climbing through a window. Now, you and I know that is not true. You and I know that the game mechanics of Skyrim do not enforce that sort of thing. But this is Leonard's thinking, which is why he generally only carried small, slender weapons, usually daggers. The only time he really has used anything bigger than a dagger was a slender, thin sword that he would normally wave around more for the visuals. If he was pretending to be a warrior in the Civil War, he would wave around a thin, slender, one-handed sword to look heroic. But as a general rule, he'd much rather walk into scenarios with just a couple of daggers because they're small, they're out of the way, and they don't take that much, strength. All they require is a little poison on the edge to be slipped into between some gap in the armor. That was my thinking. That was the way I had Leonard thinking. But obviously that was all contrived because I, Gopher, did not want to end up with another archer. Now, Leonard did have a crossbow and he kept it on his horse, and he had that weapon because there was an instance in chapter 1 where he needed to shoot a mechanism to get somewhere. So he recognized he might need a missile weapon of some sort, and he did keep one, but it was more of a, it was something he'd take off the horse, crank up, point where he thought he needed to point it, and pull the trigger like a complete amateur. I mean, he was not a bowman. He had that weapon for emergencies. Of course, he did end up using it for dragons, but again, it was a delivery mechanism for the poisons. He wasn't really a bowman. Even though he did begin to get better at it, he still wasn't a bowman. It was just that was his method of getting the poison into the dragon. What I will say about that decision is not only did it mean Leonard was constantly finding himself out of his comfort zone, it also meant Leonard was constantly searching for new tools to add to his toolbox. It's a big part of the reason he has developed so many different abilities, so many different skills that you wouldn't have imagined at the start. Had he been using a bow, he probably would not have had the sort of character development he had. And when I say character development, I do mean his skills, because his personality was pretty much constant. Unlike the Richard character, there was a lot less of a story arc of his personality, but far more change in the tool set he had, in the things he was comfortable in doing. However, I am getting a little ahead of myself. You see, originally I did not imagine the Leonard Let's Play would go on for quite as long as it did. I really never intended to do things like the College of Winterhold, the Civil War. I did not intend unlocking the dragons. I really wanted to make this a no dragon playthrough originally, and I was thinking about things like the DLC, maybe, but I had no firm plans, and I did entertain the idea of the odd mod. I would play some modded content perhaps later on. In fact, the only thing I knew for sure that I wanted to do were the first 2 chapters. I wanted to do the Thieves Guild, the Assassin's Guild, and probably the Bard's College with the whole speechcraft thing. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next video. What I now consider to be phase 1 of Leonard's story, but what originally was going to be the vast bulk of his story, chapters 1 and chapters 2. I'll also be discussing a small disaster that happened in chapter 1 that probably wouldn't seem like a disaster to any other player but me, and it ended up causing me a massive headache, and it took me 3 days to make 1 episode just because of this disaster. So I'll see if you can guess what that disaster is, and you can join me on the next episode to find out if you were right.